Hello everyone, we're back here in South France, and today's conversation is about sort of my personal grail quest for the real physics of consciousness. So today we hope to kind of tell the story of my personal quest and personal history as a way to illustrate how we really discovered a deeper insight into the true physics of consciousness. And it's a grail quest, quite literally. Now we know, because that way in which that animation of that caduceus revolving that becomes a grail is actually creates an eyeball at the center of a tornado. And we're later going to realize that that really is the holy grail solution to the real physics of consciousness. And we thought that by telling that story in a sort of a personal way with wonderful friends who are here with me, Ari, who's here filming, and Lara. Lara was with us when we did the Grail story and the Magdalene story and had wonderful questions. And Lara has a question to start today's conversation, I think.
Yes, because I'm very curious where the spark starts and where did the motivation start to do all this research to find the Grail or the... What was it where you were looking for? What did you want to find?
Yeah, like what motivated me?
Yeah.
As they say, well, I was born at a very early age, and my brother, until that time, was an only child. But I was born in a town called East of Eden, which it was just east of Eden, actually, in western New York. And I later came to realize that when John Steinbeck wrote the book East of Eden, he wrote the book about two brothers, actually. And my brother, older brother Michael, who was really a genius in his own right, an accountant, banker, and very skilled in business and real estate. And so we were two we were very intelligent. We inherited that from our mother. My mother, Thelma, she was, the Schleyer family. There were a lot of geniuses in her family, whereas my father was of the very practical, earthy, grounded, down-to-earth type, many generations of farmers. And so of course, in grammar school was a small wooden building with 4 rooms, actually, and nuns, Sister Mary Albert, as it were. And
can I interrupt you
sure,
a bit?
Yeah.
Your parents, were they, like, spiritual?
Ah, that's right. That's the right question. Well, actually, my father had a near-death experience when he was a teenager, a car accident. And I'm sure he never really spoke of it as spiritual, but I know that he was out for days, and he thought his brother might have died as a result. And so that experience, that near-death experience, was a big turning point in my father's life. So my father was definitely spiritual. Of course, very traditionally Catholic. And the church, St. Mary's Church, was just down the road where I ended up becoming church organist and choir director for many years. And my mother was church organist and choir director before me, actually, there. And so, yes, and my mother was brilliant, actually. She was a musician. She taught music for many years. And then she became a very famous and actually wealthy artist, thelmawinter.com. And there's pictures here in the room, we'll say. But she only painted what was alive, actually. And much later than actually communicating clairvoyantly with her almost after death, we discussed her clairvoyance and how that enabled her artwork.
So actually, both of your parents had flame in the blood, right?
Possibly. There's a story in the family, the Leclerc, my mother's ancestry, that having come from Alsace-Lorraine, that the Alsatian women, and Anne Rice wrote a whole book about the women from Alsace, red-haired psychokinetic, and my mother was red-haired and psychokinetic, actually, that this was the remnant of the escapees from Montsegur, actually. But it's true, at least probably, aside from the myth, was that on my mother's family, Leclerc, that they changed their name every so many years, depending whether the French or the Germans were winning the war that year in Alsace-Lorraine on the border, actually. So there was and that connects to the Cathar story of South France, and later when I sort of recognized some past life memories in France. As they say, too many lifetimes as a priest.
When did these memories start, or when you were a child, started the feeling for spirituality or the sensitivity?
That's a right question.
I guess, or you told me you were all very intelligent.
Well,
intelligence is not necessarily connected with also having this feelings of...
Exactly. Yeah, well, I mean, and you know, we took literally a little red wagon full of books every week home from the bookmobile, the portable library that came out to the country, you know. So I was steeped in the American legends at the time. But to try to answer your question, you know, I didn't think of myself as spiritual, as not spiritually oriented at that time. But I remember when I was learning to become an altar boy in church, before I learned to be a choir director, actually, that I would break out crying and weeping in church. And I was extremely embarrassed about that, actually, because I didn't know what was causing it. In later years, I realized that I had spent many lifetimes in doing churchy kind of things. I had been, as they say, a priest too many times in many lifetimes. So, but you see, I think that was the beginning that I was actually having some bliss experiences, although I would not have called them that. But I would break out crying in the church repeatedly, actually. And clearly there was... and later even, I remember in the choir, I used to have kind of trance-like experiences in the choir. So, but I didn't connect that consciously to my sense of I was on a quest until later. Actually, my sense of quest, well, to continue the story, so you know, the wooden schoolhouse, 8 years, and then St. Francis High School, Athol Springs, New York, on Lake Erie, and Franciscans. And, you know, the Franciscan Father Urban, actually, who taught us Caesar's Gallic Wars in Latin, he was a black belt, and that guy was tough. He was strong. And, you know, at that time, we thought Caesar was a hero. But I did learn my classics, and, you know, and we had you know, classical guitar playing, Catholic religious, you know, kind of ritual at that time in high school. But again, I didn't have a sense of quest then at all, actually.
But it sounds like you had these philosophical questions.
Yes.
You didn't follow just
no, I
your
had the
mentor
questions.
or your teacher.
No. You're right.
You were thinking all the time.
I had questions.
Yourself.
I had the hardest questions, that's for sure. I was considered, you know, I was always asking. Also at that time, believe it or not, in 10th grade geometry, I was considered a prodigy, and I was teaching the 10th grade class, 10th grade geometry, when I was in 10th grade, actually. Because the geometry I was a natural, actually, geometrically. I had a very visual mind. And later, my philosophy professor at college said a fantastically analytical mind. So yeah, I always had and I think I inherited that from my mother, the kind of quick mind. But in terms of where the spark came from for the quest, I need to think a little deeper here, because actually I didn't consider myself on a quest in high school.
Mm-hmm. But you had some interests.
Oh yes, I had some interests. But you know, so then after high school, for example, the French class, we had this bright idea. We needed to go to France. Valerie smiling over there. And of course, as I explained to Valerie why I didn't learn my French very well at that time, because we went to French classes at University of Montpellier, actually, when I was 19 years old. And Valerie asked how come I didn't learn my French. Well, I explained that I was interested in pretty girls and beer. Mm-hmm. So I learned 4 different names for beer and how to order a beer, but...
So in these times, you were not on a quest.
I don't.
Maybe unconsciously, because you were in France in this time already.
I was in France, yeah, and we went to sacred sites, and we did some things.
And you did this with school, or you
this
did
was
it from your personal interest?
No, we were headlined in the newspaper at the time because we just got to France, and then the travel company went bankrupt, and the usual story, and the parents had to find money to fly the kids home, and very colorful, messy, complicated, wonderful story. But no, so then I met friends that you know, convinced me about there was something to the mysteries, but I was definitely not on a quest at the point. Then what happened was in high school I was like vice president of student council, and I was not popular. In fact, I was struggle. I was unpopular, but I was bright. I was the nerd, you know. And what the result of that one thing was that I had scholarship invitations to like 6 of the most famous engineering universities in the U.S. at the time. I had scholarship invites to Clarkson, MIT, Rensselaer, Polytechnic. And I ended up going to University of Detroit, which was Jesuit, which I think was a good choice. But my uncle had gone there, Uncle Tuna we call him, and so I had the benefit of the Jesuits. And so that's the point at which the beginnings perhaps of a sense of quest, because although I was studying electrical engineering, the Jesuits were interdisciplinary everything. You know, it's like, oh, you know, these engineers, we don't want them to be just nerds. No, no, philosophy here, psychoanalysis over here. And we did in a monastery garden with an amazing Jesuit, Vern Ruland, literally studying Carl Jung in a monastery garden for years.
Is this also the place where you started to have the interest in how emotions work?
Ah, see, thank you for helping me get to the point. So what happened was, so I was studying electrical engineering. I had this amazing GM scholarship, which was, so it was kind of all expenses paid. It was good karma, I guess. And, but I became interested in the psychology department. And what happened was, it's kind of a long story in between, but I became the engineer and designer for the amplifiers in the polygraph at the University of Detroit Psychophysiology Clinic.
So in easy words?
Well, this was the clinic where they did biofeedback for people who had hypertension, high blood pressure, headaches. And so they were specialized in dealing with hypertension. And the polygraph, there was 8 psychophysiological variables we used there: finger plethysmogram, GSR, a respirometer, 8 variables to measure the difference between fear and anger, actually.
Okay.
And we were the first, actually Albert Axe there was the first on the planet to measure the difference between emotions in pure electrical terms. So yes, that was a big part.
That was the start.
That was, yeah, well,
or maybe the start already in France.
I mean, actually, there might even be a specific day there when I realized that the engineering students, you're measuring their GSR, which is just the measurement of resistance on the skin, and that you show them Playboy magazine, and it's faster than any transistor switch. You know, it goes, boom, immediately. That was, you know. So electrically, obviously, emotion was a faster switch than anything we had seen before. Hello.
Yeah.
And you know what? When you show them Playboy magazine, the resistance goes down. Does that tell you?
Interesting.
It's like permission to touch, you know. Because it's simply a measure of resistance. But how fast? You know, they say, well, they call it Palmer sweating and GSR, galvanic skin resistance. But how fast that switch is, that the resistance at the level of these 2 fingers typically, and you're measuring simply resistance. And you do plant polygraphy the same way. I later did it with Cleve Baxter, measuring plants. And later in the story, when we talk about Marcel Vogel affecting the plant polygraph, it was the same tool, actually. It was a GSR transducer on plant leaves. So
when you realize this, you put more time to
study
this, or
I started asking messier questions. So I studied psychophysiology, which is physics of psychology, physics of emotion. But then actually what happened was, to kind of make the story a bit thematic, so I graduated actually magna cum laude at University of Detroit, electrical engineering and psychology, but then I was hired by IBM. And IBM put me through training in Detroit, Chicago, and Poughkeepsie. I spent months in Chicago in training. And to jump ahead in the story, the lead teacher in the Chicago training school for IBM systems analysts was a Gurdjeff aficionado.
Ah, yeah. So this is where you started to know Gurdjeff.
Yeah, and ended up in the Gurdjieff's School of Sacred Gymnastics. But actually what happened in sequence then, after, you know, I owe some karma to IBM because they trained me, very expensive training. I got the best in the world training. But then I decided to go back to graduate school, see. And of course IBM, my manager at IBM was it was a tough moment because that was not. And my mother thought I had gone insane for the second or third time. And so then I went back to graduate school and studied advanced psychophysiology and really started asking hard questions about the physics of emotion. And that actually was my quest at that moment, was the physics of emotion.
The physics of emotion.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, I think later when I met Manfred Kleins, who wrote the book Sentics on the psychophysics, the music of emotions, and I did that work at goldenmean.info/touch, where they measured the change in pressure over time of the squeeze that says, I love you, versus the squeeze that says, I'm angry with you. if you measure that squeeze 1,000 times, and they did, and make a graph of the change in pressure over time, you can identify those emotions very accurately. So, for example, if you're squeezing your child to say, I'm angry with you, the point of maximum pressure in that squeeze will be 1/7 into the duration of the event every time, which is, by the way, destructive interference. Optimized. So, anger to kick the money changers out of the temple is electrically destructive wave interference. But Manfred had made those measurements, but I did the ratios. He didn't calculate. He didn't find out, for example, that in the measurement of the most delayed max pressure emotion, which is love, the squeeze that says I love you, and they've measured it thousands of times, every single time, the point of maximum pressure in that squeeze is tantrically delayed. Does not happen in the first part. You wait till 0.618 into the duration of that squeeze to say I love you, which literally sets up that cascade of waves that implodes, literally. And that 0.618 duration delay in the touch that says I love you mathematically identifies the love hug.
And you say you did the ratio?
In
What
other
do you
words,
mean by that?
Manfred Klein's, he was a beautiful concert musician, and he played the guitar, played the violin, and he, as we said many times, he became fascinated because he admired people who could play the violin well enough to make people weep.
Ah, yeah.
So he studied the physics of what change in violin technique caused people to cry. He wanted to know.
Yeah.
It was a very good question.
Yeah. So that was a good cooperation.
Yes.
Between you.
Yes, but I didn't meet Manfred Klein until some years later. But the point is, when you said, so he did the work on mapping those wave ratios in the book Syntax. But then it was my work that I took the beginning of the event, the end of the event, and the point of max pressure of the event, and calculate the ratio. That was my work. And so it was my discovery that 1/7 identified anger, and 1/0.618 identifies love. That was my discovery, actually. And Manfred, we discussed that, and he said the timing of the end of the event can make that somewhat subjective. But when you do enough of the events and look at the shape of those waves, for example, it's so cool, the touch that says joy is 1/6. The touch that says love is 0.618, very much delayed, is golden ratio. The touch that says anger, 1/7. It's exactly how you create maximum destructive wave interference. I mean, that's, anger, clear the money changers out of the temple, destructive wave interference. Yeah. It's perfect. So psychophysics of the emotion, and that work was, that was post-graduate school. But in graduate school, that's the kind of thing I was doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and at which point you started to continue to?
Well,
because this was kind of wow, that's amazing. And when?
Well, actually, see, the next part of that story, up until that time, this was definitely a stuck in your head kind of approach. I would admit it perfectly. I was not grounded. I was. Probably you would say I was not in my body. I was a stuck in your head kind of engineering kind of guy, almost for sure. No, the turning point there was then I did the part of graduate school that was scholarship, and then I was looking around for more fun. And my teacher at the Gurdjiff, at the IBM school said, "Ooh, there's that Gurdjeff school down there." And I was like, "Ooh," and I had read Meetings with Remarkable Men. And this story today is my story of Meetings with Remarkable Men, actually. Yeah. And so, short story, I ended up in Charlestown, West Virginia, Claymont.org, Gurdjieff School, doing sacred gymnastic, actually. And that's when it turned from a stuck-in-your-head approach, for sure.
So this was a turning point when you
for
went
sure.
there?
Well, in terms of first conscious bliss experiences, for sure. And even then, it was later in the beginning of the Gurdjieff school, I was still stuck in the head, for sure.
But you had already the bliss experiences.
Well, I had, when I was a kid, some bliss experiences, done some dance, but I was never conscious of having a bliss experience up until that point. No. So, but then in the Gurdjieff school, the Gurdjieff sacred gymnastic, and later I was, I trained with Sufis all over the world, actually. But in the Gurdjieff school was the beginning for me. And yes, Gurdjieff had his book, Beelzebub's Tales to his Grandson, which we read aloud, which is a huge book. And Beelzebub, we later learned, is basically Enki. and his grandson is us, you know. And Gurdjeff was famous for his project on the Enneagram. And later in this story, we're going to learn the story of the 9, the plasma physics of advanced plasma intelligence is the 9. And I didn't make that connection until 30 years later, but we were studying the Enneagram with Gurdjeff, which was the geometry of how emotions proceed in an archetypal sequence.
Ah, so this is also where your study with emotions kind of
makes connection to the feeling. Yeah, so for me,
the archetypes and some kind of sacred geometry.
Well, you know, Rashad Field visited us, and Tony, we had many famous visitors. Actually, our teacher at the Gurdjieff School was Pierre Elliott, who famously had been with Gurdjieff at the Prairie here in France, actually. And you know, we were indoctrinated or taught the Sufi approach, actually, which was valuable because later we had Sufi conferences at my farm later in this story, and you know, this was my introduction to the Sufis, which were a big part of my path. But clearly the turning point was doing the sacred gymnastic, the sacred dance, and starting to have, you know, feel that electricity of charge. And I think they were right that initially, if you want to have a bliss experience, you probably need a group to get the critical mass for enough electrical inertia to feel it. Then later you can do it yourself. But to start with, you probably need a group. And that was a Gurdjieff teaching, and we had a powerful group. We were, you know, just like the film at the end of Meetings with Remarkable Men, where they're in these rows and you can feel a snap, crackle, pop. They say that the charge was so strong it imbued the celluloid of the film used to make the movie. That's the story. So, but, you know, we were in George Washington's nephew's mansion, gorgeous, ancient mansion, obviously on the top of the hill, magnetic lines all over, and so that was an opportunity.
And you say the Sufi approach was very important.
Yes, even at that time.
Can you tell something about
Well, you know, scholastically, you see the Sufis as the esoteric branch of the Muslim tradition, analogous to the Essenes as esoteric branch of the Christian. But there's more to it than that. Obviously, the Sufis had very evolved techniques for bliss induction, obviously. And later,
these things you were practicing in the Gurdjieff school.
Oh yeah, like the turn, for example, the dervish turn. And we even learned, I don't know if it was then, but we learned the physics of, well, maybe later, that when the student does the turning for the dervish master, the fact that the student does not get dizzy is the measurement of whether they had pure intention, literally. And now we understand a lot about the physics of that. Your ability to make gravity, that charge implosion that enables you to not be dizzy when you're doing that spin, is the physics of the implosion that demonstrates a shareable wave, literally a pure intention.
And did they also combine the physics with the experience in the Gurdjieff school, or is this something you did personally?
She's asking the right questions. She's asking hard questions.
Yeah, that's right.
No, it's a very appropriate question. No, we were not encouraged to be intellectual, scholarly, mathematics, or scientific about it, no. And actually, I have to say that Sufism in general was not about the physics. It was about the bliss.
Yeah, so first you did all the physics, and then you had a very intensive time doing the experience?
I studied the electrical engineering, but I did not understand the physics of consciousness. No, at that time, if you had asked me if I knew the physics, I would have told you, no, I don't really. So that was my quest. So in the Gurdjieff school, I had the bliss experiences, and I started to think about these mysteries, and was interested in the electrical nature of, but I didn't have the answers for sure. I did not have the answers at that point.
But you worked with the physics of the emotions.
Well, I had.
So you had kind of a clue, maybe?
The first clue, maybe. But, you know, I didn't figure out what the physics of emotion. You know, the fact that golden ratio was related to love, which we only really discovered years later anyway, to see that that is a solution to implosive compression, that came years later, actually. So, yes, in the meantime, well, what happened, actually, I have a chart. So one of the things I did was I started to make this sequential, actually. So I went to the Gurdjieff school, and there, at the end, my parents drove down from Western New York to West Virginia, a long way, to make sure their son hadn't fallen off the edge into a cult or, you know. And the teacher of the Gurdjieff school, Pierre, treated my parents like royalty. He was wonderful, actually. And it was an amazing scene, actually. It was quite interesting. There's lots of symbolism there. But so the result was that I actually went back to Western New York, and I decided I'm going to, you know, that's what they told you at the end of the Gurdjieff school. Okay, you had a little bliss. Now don't fall off the edge. You go back and prove you can go back into the world and live your life. That was the instruction at the end of the Gurdjieff school. And don't become ungrounded, basically, is what I learned later. And I went back to Western New York, and I became the lead engineer at the family business for like 20 years after that, is what I did next.
And you still had the bliss experience in these times?
Well, you see, that's the thing. So shortly after the Gurdjieff school, I began to have intense Kundalini experiences. And that's when, as Valerie was asking, Jean Ringe ran Human Dimensions Institute in Western New York, very famous. She did the studies with Uri Geller, and she did the studies with about damaged trypsin enzymes healing with Oscar Estebany. Beautiful work, Jean Ringe, very famous. Human Dimensions, Western New York. And she had a center on Lake Canandaigua, Human Dimensions, where we were telling the story about the dog that chased me down the road to make sure I did my Kundalini. It was an amazing story. Well, so I started attending these advanced events, and I learned about Bentoff, and I was introduced indirectly to Gopi Krishna, who wrote the book on Kundalini, who was good friends with Jean Ringe.
So you did your own study next to your
That's right.
working
I
life,
stayed and I set up an electronics lab and I built my first Star Mother kit in the basement of my parents' home in Western New York, east of Eden. But I stayed there and I did my Dharma, actually. And then I bought a farm not in the hometown, Crystal Hill Farm.
You kept practicing, studying.
Well, then I started Western New York's first conscious newspaper network of light, and we had the biggest national Sufi dance healing conferences at my farm. I bought Crystal Hill Farm in Western New York, and we had fire walks at the farm, and we had labyrinths over here, and we had the Sufis over there, and, so my farm became something of a mecca. But all the while, I was running the technical side of the family business, electric motor engineering. That's what I was doing. I was the director of the service portion of electric motor and generator business. So I was the troubleshooter, Sparky the motor whiz in the motor shop. And in some ways, I was a bit of a genius at that. You could say humbly, but I was very good at that. And I began to actually teach the electrical engineers of the Electrical Inspectors Association of Western New York. Our project at that time was discovering how stray ground currents caused the cows to stop drinking water and destroy the farm. So a classic example, and I was teaching these classes. The family walks into the electrical apparatus inspectors, the Electrical Inspectors Association where I was teaching, and the family's crying. And that week they lost all the cows. They lost the farm, $500,000 farm. And you know what they finally discovered cost them that farm was the day the cable TV engineer pounded in the ground rod from the cable TV and shot that poisonous, wasted, fractionated, bad amperage into the ground. And that stray electricity in the ground, the cow would get a microvolt every time they touched their water. And no cow would drink water on that farm until they found that problem. Meantime, they lost $500,000 and the farm. The state of Wisconsin had figured this out years before, but Western New York was behind. But once you start studying stray ground currents and agriculture, that leads you to geobiology, and which is actually dowsing.
You discovered the.
Well, I don't say I wouldn't say I discovered that connection. I was able to teach about it, and I actually worked with a famous scientist in Wisconsin who actually made some of these discoveries. So I was doing that I was teaching those classes in Western New York.
So when the when did the quest continue?
The quest for the holy grail of the physics.
What I hear now is that there must be some new spark, that you stop the work and or
the grail quest for the physics of consciousness. The next part of that story is Giza pyramids, Peru, Findhorn,
so
in South
how
America.
did you get to that?
That's the next, and that's after a short pause.
Okay.